So today we're talking about addressing inequalities in sport and physical activity participation. So let me set this in some kind of context. So since the early Greeks, the role of physical activity in promoting health and well-being has been recognised, and this is evidenced by the quote by Hippocrates. So if we could give every individual the right amount of nourishment and exercise, not too little and not too much, we would have the safest way to health. So we know that participation in regular physical activity in sport is associated with over 20 chronic conditions. So I think we've picked up an extra 3 since Marie's talk earlier. So this includes heart disease, diabetes, cancer, obesity, etc. And as well as those health benefits, there are also broader benefits, particularly in terms of improved mental well-being, improved cognitive function, and also in academic achievement. So the UK guidelines were published in 2011, and they recommended that adults participate in at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity, so that which makes you slightly out of breath. However, recent results from Northern Ireland show that only half of the population are actually meeting that recommendation. Participating in 150 minutes per week has actually been associated with a 30% lower risk of death than those who do not participate in physical activity. And current levels of inactivity account for approximately 5.3 million deaths per year, which is on a par with smoking. So today we're specifically focusing on inequalities in sport and physical activity participation. And there are certain groups in our society who do not even achieve the modest proportions of activity, and these are really the groups who would have actually most to gain in terms of the benefits from health and well-being. So for example, females are considerably lower physical activity levels than males, so with 40% of females compared to 60% actually meeting the recommendations. In terms of areas of deprivation, so only 43% of those in the most deprived areas of Northern Ireland meet the recommendations, compared to 60% in the least deprived areas. If we look at age, Northern Ireland is projected to have the most rapid increase in terms of an ageing population, with around 23% of our population projected to be over 65 by 2035. Levels of inactivity actually increase with age, with 75% of adults aged 50 and over not meeting their current recommendations in Northern Ireland. And then in terms of disabilities, people with a disability are significantly less likely to be active, with only 23% actually meeting those recommendations. So clearly we are failing to reduce the inequalities that exist in terms of sport and physical activity participation. So much more focused attention is required in this area, and we believe that the first step in addressing those inequalities is actually to identify factors that are related to inactivity in these groups that can help us then actually target physical activity programs developed to help those most in need. So to begin with, we wanted to look at actual knowledge of guidelines. So knowledge of how much physical activity we should be doing has been shown to have to be an important first step to being regularly physically active. So as Marie mentioned, the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines in 2011 recommended that adults do at least 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity activity. And knowledge of this information is an important prerequisite to influencing our beliefs and social norms around physical activity. So the hierarchy of effects model shown on the slide shows how this works in 3 important steps. So firstly, to raise our attention or our awareness that such guidelines exist and the importance of physical activity. To then increase our comprehension of those messages, so that around the benefits of activity, how much we should be doing and why we should be doing that, and then around moving on to acceptance of how much we should be doing and that this is an important area to tackle. However, a recent survey, again using Sport Northern Ireland data, demonstrated that only 8% of adults in Northern Ireland were actually aware of physical activity guidelines, and this paper was published early last year in a journal, Preventive Medicine. So who is unaware? So again, using Sport Northern Ireland data, for males, we can see, so males with a lower level of education are over 5 times more likely to be unaware of the physical activity guidelines. Those living in the most deprived areas, those with low income, and those who currently don't do any physical activity are much less likely to actually be aware of how much physical activity we should be doing. If we look at females, those who are younger and those who report poor health are much less likely to actually be aware of how much physical activity that we should be participating in. So clearly there's a need for action, and clearly there is a need for a public health campaign to raise awareness about how much physical activity adults in Northern Ireland should be engaging in. Designing this campaign to specifically target those groups identified in most of need could lead to a more effective campaign. So social media, for example, could be one particular platform, such as Twitter, which may aid local health departments in terms of informing and educating the population. And social media is now beginning to be harnessed for health promotion within our health departments. And it may be particularly useful to help target particularly our younger population. And we're currently working in collaboration with the Public Health Agency to design a campaign which we hope to launch next year. Social media has particular benefits in terms of enabling us to specifically target messages at those most in need. To reach a large audience in real time allows for interaction and also at low cost. Also, GPs and physios can play a central role really in health promotion, and they're well placed to deliver physical activity and health promotion, particularly to those of poor health who we identified as a group in need. Indeed, recent reports in the British Medical Journal and from the Royal College of General Practitioners emphasise the importance of physical activity and really the role that the doctor has to play in actually prioritising it. So knowing how much physical activity we should be doing and then actually doing sufficient physical activity are of course two very different things. So this next set of slides really looks more particularly at who's doing sufficient physical activity, or more so who's not meeting those recommendations. So as stated previously, we know that about half the population of adults in Northern Ireland actually meet those recommendations, and clearly these guidelines need to be followed up by innovative and sustainable action. However, increasing the proportion of the population actually meeting those guidelines presents a real considerable societal challenge. Given the limited resource we have for health promotion, there's a real need to help target those resources at those we've identified as actually target groups and those in need of help. So again, developing an understanding of the actual characteristics of those who are not meeting the guidelines can help us target specific groups and develop evidence-based population-level physical activity interventions. So again, using Sport Northern Ireland data, we undertook a study to investigate the characteristics of those doing no physical activity, those that did some but not enough to meet the guidelines, and then those who were meeting the guidelines, to see if there were certain subgroups in there that would identify those particularly that we could target. So we undertook some econometric modelling techniques to really model various policy relevant stereotypes. And again, we can see for males, so those most in need, so older adults, so males aged 55 years or older, again, economically inactive, no car, poor health, living in most deprived areas, so very similar to the subgroups that were identified for lack of knowledge of guidelines. And again, if we look at females, poor health, so again, very similar to groups that were identified in terms of lack of knowledge around our guidelines. So these results have implications for public health policy and practice, and addressing these inequalities in participation are particularly challenging. Results suggest that potentially targeting some socio-demographic characteristics can actually help us identify important subgroups and target specific interventions to maximise our limited resources in this area. And this suggests a move away from a one-size-fits-all approach towards interventions that are tailored to specific groups in order to halt the physical inactivity pandemic that we're currently in.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you for the opportunity to come and share a little bit more of our research. What I want to do for the last part of this seminar is to explore two specific groups that have been brought up by one way or the other in most of the talks we've heard so far. The first of these groups is to look at physical inactivity in older adults. Ruth alluded to this earlier. 3/4 of older adults in Northern Ireland don't do enough physical activity to benefit their health. That's significantly worse than the Republic of Ireland and significantly worse than the UK. And marry that against the knowledge that we have the fastest growing rates of older adults in Northern Ireland with an expected increase that outstrips the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland. We really are at a time of intervention if we were to halt the issues associated with this. Previous research we have done around desired types of activities that older adults would like to do has indicated that sport may not so much up the list of wanted activities, but what really came out the top was social activity, meeting other people, engaging in people, trying to avoid that social isolation that we know is a big issue in our society. And obviously the way to get out and meet other people is to be able to engage in some form of active travel, to get out and walk, or at least use some form of active travel as part of a mode of journey to go to places and to go and meet people. And the Minister alluded to that, the need of people in place earlier on. So what we wanted to do was to really bore down a little bit more detail on the key factors associated with active travel in older adults. And using the Sport Northern Ireland SAPAS data set, we looked at the associations between taking part in some active travel in the previous week versus none. And by some, we meant at least a 10-minute bout of walking or cycling or something like that to get to and from places. In the data set, what we identified was a number of factors that were associated with not taking part in active travel or conversely taking part. And I want to unpick some of those with you. Neighbourhood deprivation, when we went into the analysis, we presumed, as in all other analyses, that activity participation would be lower if you were from more deprived neighbourhoods. The converse of that is actually true when it comes to active travel. And that would indicate that active travel might be one of the early solutions to addressing the inactivity pandemic the inactivity inequalities in certain groups. So you're more likely to take part in walking for active travel if you live in deprived neighbourhoods. Now that makes common sense, but as researchers we like to prove it with the data when you reflect on it, because you don't have cars to use, you may live in dense urban situations that it's easier to get around. One of the other issues we identified was that you're much less likely to engage in any active travel if you have some self-reported disability or health issue. But the two main ones that we really picked up was urban dwelling and a more supportive environment. So living in an urban dwelling means that you have access to shops, but more importantly than that, you have access to mixed mode travel. So you've got buses and trains. And in a recent report from DRD indicated that 41% of people who live in rural locations, in other words, those who are much less likely to take part in active travel, would consider taking the bus or the train if they had better proximity to bus stops. This is not a DRD issue. To me, this is a Department of Health issue. This is a DSD issue. Because what we need to do is to support rural communities to engage with each other and engage with other communities. I've looked at the literature across the world about how we solve the inequality gap in activity participation in rural versus urban adults and older adults. And there's very little information out there. But our early indication would suggest that, well, perhaps by supporting active travel in certain rural settings might help redress those activity inequalities. And the other thing is supportive environments. In other words, having facilities close by. Again, seems like an obvious thing, and our colleagues in San Diego have pushed this boat much forward and shown that if you live close to transportation facilities, if you live close to recreational facilities, you're much more likely to meet your recommended amount of physical activity. And so we need investment into those facilities, both from a physical activity perspective, from a transport perspective to get people moving about, but also from a social development perspective to helping communities re-engage and to prevent the social isolation that occurs in some individuals as they age. The next group I want to just draw your attention to then is those who report some level of disability or indeed a long-term illness. Little is known really when you look at the literature about why people with a long-term illness don't participate in regular sport or physical activity. Using the continuous household survey data and working with DCAL statisticians, we were able to identify that individuals who report a long-term illness or a disability are much less likely to participate in any sport or any physical activity. So we looked at the data and we thought, well, what did they do in the last year? And in the last year, those without a long-term illness, about half of them took part in some kind of sport or physical activity in the last year. That's quite a long time frame, but at least it was something in the last year. When we look at those who report a long-term illness, only 25% of them take part in any kind of sport at least once in the last year. That's quite a shocking statistic, and one I think we need to begin to redress. So we looked at the data. We had 13,000 individuals, and we classified those as those who reported having a long-term illness or disability, and those that didn't. And we looked at the associations between those who took part in some activity or not. So, who were those who meet the target? Well, if you had a long-term illness and fell into the first category of older adults, you were much less likely to not take any sport or physical activity in the last year. So we need to combine those two things and think about investment into programs, widespread programs to help older adults, particularly those with an illness, to engage in regular physical activity. Rural dwelling comes up again in this. These are sort of common themes that we find. Married females, so we'll come back to the gender issue again, particular issue, and socioeconomically disadvantaged individuals. So what we need to do is to think through how we might support those. And there's been a big move towards e-health or m-health solutions to supporting older adults, and particularly adults with a long-standing illness, to engage in their own health. And I just have one more point to make on that, and that is when we looked at the likelihood of individuals who participate in sport and their internet access, now slightly unusual analysis, we found that people with a disability were much less likely in the first place to have internet access than those without a disability. So we're almost giving the wrong solution to the wrong problem. And perhaps for this group, E-type solutions aren't the best approach, and we need to continue to invest in those social development or health programs that are working with individuals. So in conclusion, what do we begin to learn? Well, we've seen quite compelling evidence from across the presentations that inactivity is a major concern. We've seen that there are benefits from engaging societies and individuals in regular activity, but we require some targeted efforts if we're to really redress the inequalities that exist. For certain populations, a health promotion campaign will be what's most required. For the general population, perhaps we need some more targeted approaches, thinking about the context that people live in and the situation that they live in for older adults and those with disabilities. So what could we do about that? Well, I realise that planning decisions have been devolved to local administration, but we think there's a role for central administration in planning policy. And I think lots of our planning policies need to take health and social aspects into the decision-making framework when they're making decisions about both housing developments and also occupational and other social developments. Supporting better public infrastructure with continued investment in rural transport networks, to me, is very important, and we've shown that as important within the data, and the sort of political endorsement that would come behind those programs to make sure that those are wide-scale and indeed delivered with appropriate funding behind them. So in conclusion, let me encourage you all this evening, on a nice evening, to try to accumulate your level of necessary amount of physical activity, your 150 minutes this week, and think of those who have external challenges to engaging in their activity, whether those are cultural norms, whether those is a lack of knowledge, whether it's a limitation in physical ability, and to think through in our policies and our programs how we support those who are most in need. Thank you very much.